and welcome to my channel if this is the first video of mine that you are watching, but if it is not, welcome back. Today I'm going to be chatting through some of my best reads so far in 2025 throughout the first quarter of this year. And I will say that while I have read a lot of books so far this year, a lot of them have been like middle of the road or a low 4-star for me. I haven't read very many 5-star books, but I have been enjoying what I've been reading, and the half dozen of books or so that I'm going to talk about today are the best of the best that I've read so far this year. Before I dive into the books, however, I do have a cocktail pairing for today's video. And this cocktail doesn't actually have a name because I just threw together some things that I thought would taste nice. And spoiler alert, I did have a few sips of this in the kitchen and it does taste amazing. But I started by muddling some blackberries with about a teaspoon of simple syrup before I added in a shot of white rum, threw some ice in the shaker and shook that all together until it was nice and cold, strained it into a glass, added some more ice, and then topped it up with a blackberry sparkling water. And it smells amazing, it tastes amazing, and it looks amazing with this really nice dark purple color. So like I said, I've already stolen a taste in the kitchen, but cheers. Yeah, that is super, super refreshing. So I'm going to be sipping on that cocktail as I chat through the best books I have read so far this year. And the first book that I'm going to talk about today is one that I do have a physical copy of, but I actually listened to the audiobook of this book, and that is All Together Now, A Newfoundlander's Light Tales for Heavy Times by Alan Doyle. And my fellow Canadians will likely recognize Alan Doyle as the frontman for Great Big Sea, and I absolutely adore Great Big Sea. And I have seen Alan Doyle perform. He's an amazing performer, and he is the narrator for this audiobook. And he has such a beautiful voice. I find his Newfoundland accent to be incredibly comforting, and he had me laughing out loud at so many points in time. Like, I was folding laundry and howling. I had to go out and shovel my car and stopped in the middle of the street to just let out this cackle because his delivery in the audiobook of his book All Together Now was so amazing. His timing was spot on, and I do think that I enjoyed his story in All Together Now more because I listened to him narrate it. I think I got more out of the audiobook than I would have gotten just reading this physical copy myself. So if you are looking for a lighter read that just takes a little bit of the edge off of the world right now, I would recommend All Together Now, because at its core, it's a really heartwarming tale that's delivered with amazing humor, in my personal opinion. Another lighter read that I read back in January was The Mistletoe Motive by Chloe Liese, and I absolutely loved this little story. This is a holiday rom-com novella, and it feels a little bit silly to be speaking about a holiday story in April, but so be it. I loved this book. It is what I would call my quintessential holiday story. The setting is within a bookshop, and we're following two co-workers who are enemies to lovers, Gabby and Jonathan. And in addition to being co-workers who hate one another, they also communicate online as pen pals essentially, and have a really strong bond through this anonymous friendship online. And I loved the way that the author incorporated this theme in quite a healthy way, I would say, because typically there's always a character who finds out that their online pen pal is their in real life enemy or friend. And I found that the character who finds out first within the Mistletoe motive did not exploit that knowledge in any way. So I really enjoyed the way that that trope was handled. And there's also a little bit of competitiveness within this story because our characters Gabby and Jonathan are competing to see who can have the most sales before Christmas Day, because they make a deal or a bet that whoever has the most sales will be the employee who stays on through into and past the new year. So there's a lot of tropes taking place in the Mistletoe motive. It's quite lighthearted, even though the author does touch on a few more serious themes, and it is an own voices novel for a character with autism, Gabby. I loved the way that Chloe Liese handled everything throughout this book. It was and is, I think, my ideal holiday romance story / fantasy. I wish I could just live in a little bookshop and lead up to the holidays and help people choose the perfect book for them and to gift their loved ones. I just loved the setup of this novella, and it is one that I think I will reread in anticipation of the holidays this winter. Another best read of 2025 for me is A Sorceress Comes to Call by T. Kingfisher. I have already spoken about this book a little bit, so I'll try to be brief, famous last words, but I loved Kingfisher's retelling of Goose Girl. We are following a young protagonist who is in her early teens, I believe, and she has been really awfully abused by her mother, who is the sorceress in this picture. But her mother takes her to this manor house in the country because her mother has set eyes on marrying this rich old man to secure their place within society, because she wants to ensure that Cordelia also marries well, and she's wanting to like marry off her 14-year-old daughter. And it's just, there's a lot of heavy themes within this book, but there are also themes of found family, which I adore, and resilience and triumph in the face of adversity, which again are themes that I also adore. But that is because when they arrive at this manor house, this rich old man has a sister who sees through Cordelia's mother's ruse instantly, and she sets out to save her brother from this horrible fate and quickly finds herself endeared to Cordelia as well, and wants to save Cordelia from being underneath her mother's wing. And she sees the awfulness that Cordelia has endured and wants to make sure that Cordelia is safe and warm and happy too. Similar to Kingfisher's other books and other writing, there is this very whimsical, magical feel to this world and otherworldliness, as I very often say. So we are dealing with magic and spirits and demons and creatures and all sorts of things within A Sorceress Comes to Call. And I love the way that Kingfisher weaves all of these fantastical elements together into this beautiful, full world. And the stakes are quite high in this book, and Kingfisher does not hold back on some really horrific descriptions and very brutal descriptions as well. I've said this before, but if you enjoyed Nettle and Bone, I think you would also really enjoy A Sorceress Comes to Call. And likewise, if you really enjoyed this book, I think you would also enjoy Nettle and Bone. But yes, A Sorceress Comes to Call was one of my best books so far of this year. Kingfisher creates this very Regency-esque setting within this book that we know I love a historical Regency romance setting, and I loved Kingfisher's more fantastical take on such a familiar setting and trope for me. Speaking of historical romances, my next best read of 2025 is a little bit of a cheat because I am going to talk about the Brothers Sinister series by Courtney Milan as a whole, because I can't pick one favorite book from this series. And what I love most about this series is when you take a step back and really look at it as a larger piece of fiction. I adore the way that Milan recreated Regency England in these books and novellas, while also tweaking and altering the course of history to provide more visible diversity within her books. She speaks quite often in her author's note about the invisible women of history, and there's so much that we don't know about women in the path of scientific discovery, because so often it was their husbands who threw their name on that paper and took credit for the discovery. And there are a few instances in historical texts where there's a husband and wife duo, and the division of labor of how much the husband contributed to the scientific experiments and all of that is contestable when you look at it with a critical 21st century eye. And I loved reading Milan's author notes because throughout the course of the Brothers Sinister series, we are following women scientists, women computers. Not only does Milan inject more diversity in the form of women running and owning newspapers and women scientists, and she has racial diversity within the pages of her books, as well as LGBTQ plus representation. And I just think she is doing such important work for the genre of historical romance as a whole. And I absolutely loved this series and following along with these characters. Each book features a new female protagonist, and while they are all attached, she mentions in her author's notes, and I absolutely loved reading her author's notes at the end of each book or novella, but she mentions that her intention was to expand the circle of friends and colleagues around each protagonist with each subsequent book. So while we are following someone who is mentioned in a previous book, their circle is really expanded, and we don't necessarily see a whole lot of the previous characters in the subsequent books. There's a few exceptions to that, and I think they were exceptions that were done incredibly well. But I've just rambled on for about 10 minutes about the Brothers Sinister series. So clearly I cannot sing its praises enough. It was hands down one of my best discoveries of 2025 so far, and I'm so happy that I have much more Milan material to read next. My next best read of 2025 is also the end of a series, so I'm going to have to talk more broadly about the series as a whole, but that is Kingdom of Ash by Sarah J. Maas. I began reading this series last year, and if you recall, I didn't love it right away. I think this series took me 3 or 4 books, and there's only 7 books in the series, but it took me until about book 4, I think, to really become invested in the plight of these characters. And that aligns pretty well with where I suddenly was being surprised by the plot and the actions, because I knew so much of the setup of this world. It took me a long time before I was suddenly being surprised by these characters and by their actions, and then I was invested. I don't think that this is a new favorite series for me personally, but I do think that Maas did an incredible job with this final book. I think Kingdom of Ash was a fantastic conclusion to this series. It can be so difficult to stick the landing of a big, large, high fantasy series. And in Throne of Glass, there were so many moving parts. There were multiple enemies that had to be dealt with within this final book. And I think Maas did a great job of doing so without sacrificing too many of our beloved characters. And it still felt as if there was a real cost to our main core. I don't actually know what the consensus is in the fandom of how a lot of Maas fans feel about Kingdom of Ash, but for me personally, I thought it was a great conclusion to Throne of Glass, and I'm really happy that I can say I have finished this series, and I would say that Kingdom of Ash was one of my best reads of 2025 so far. My penultimate best book so far of this year is Divine Rivals by Rebecca Ross, and this book felt so similar to A River Enchanted to me, just with the way our characters interacted with one another and how they grew to care for one another and their vows to one another. It felt very similar to A River Enchanted, and I mean that as a compliment. I mean that in a good way, because I absolutely adored A River Enchanted and A Fire Endless by Rebecca Ross, and likewise I really, really enjoyed Divine Rivals. Ross creates within this duology this fantastical interpretation of the 1940s. It is a world in which the science and technology feels very reminiscent to the 1940s, with typewriters being such a prominent theme, and also tram cars and the importance of newspapers within this fictional world. There's also the parallel with our own 1940s past of a war going on within this fictional setting. However, this is a war of the gods, and there are really old ancient gods that have reawoken and are interfering with the plight of humans and recruiting them for their own war against one another. And our main characters become war correspondents and travel to the front lines of this war. And Divine Rivals ends on quite a bit of a cliffhanger, because it introduces this new character into play. I'm not sure how much more I can say without spoiling the plot for Divine Rivals, so I think I'll leave it there with just I adore Ross's interpretation of the 1940s and how she took that decade and evoked that period within a more fantastical setting with magic and with monsters afoot. And I'm really excited to see how she concludes this story in Ruthless Vows. But that leads us to my final best read of 2025 so far, which has been my only 5-star read so far this year, I believe. But likewise, it is the sequel to a duology. So I'm going to have to talk about this duology as a whole. And that is, of course, The Sarantine Mosaic by Gavriel K. I read Lord of Emperors back in February after I began this duology with Sailing to Sarantium sometime last year. And I adore this series and I adore this author. I talk about him as often as I can. So I have already gone on and on about this duology at length, but I really, really adored Lord of Emperors. Throughout this duology, we are following a mosaicist, Crispin, and he is front and center throughout sailing to Sarantium. But I would say he takes a little bit of a backseat throughout the first third or the first half of Lord of Emperors before things circle back to following Crispin. We are following a lot of his supporting cast of characters throughout the first half of this book and understanding a little bit more of this world. And one thing that I speak so often about is the way that Kay evokes real periods of our history within these magical realism-esque settings. So the Sarantine Mosaic takes place in an alternative Byzantine Empire. And rather than go on and on with my interpretation of that parallel between reality and fantastical, I decided for this video I would actually go directly to Gavriel Kay's official website, Bright Weavings, and pull what it says about the historical parallels with the Byzantine Empire and the Sarantine Mosaic. So it says here that Caius Valerius, who is the emperor within the Sarantine Mosaic, is closely modeled on Justinian, who was the emperor of the Byzantine Empire from 527 to 565 Common Era. And Justinian's goal was to reunify the old Roman Empire by reconquering as much as possible. He also promoted cultural revival through the patronage of art and architecture, with his most magnificent project being the Church of Holy Wisdom in Constantinople. However, obviously the Byzantine Empire failed, and as a result of subsequent invasions, there was a debate, or there was internal theological controversy over the proper use of images in worship, which led to the destruction of a great deal of religious art, and it significantly weakened the empire. And that is what Kay is foreshadowing, specifically within Lord of Emperors. Kay is creating these characters in a time right before those invasions, right before the death of Valerius or Justinian and the subsequent failing and falling of the empire, to show that even at its absolute height, the wealth and the power of the Sarantine Empire is vulnerable and transitory. In addition to those historical parallels and themes, I adore Kay's characters. He is an author who manages to do both incredibly deep world building while also creating incredibly complex characters. And I love the way that his characters feel so real because they have hopes and dreams and aspirations. They also have failings and they make mistakes, and suddenly those mistakes are changing the trajectory of their life, and they need to learn to roll with the punches or try and get the cart off of the tracks. I adore the ripple effect that Kay depicts within all of his books. I think he is an incredible author, and I think he is an author who does not receive as much praise or hype as he deserves, and that is why I talk about him at any opportunity that I can. So yes, it should come as no surprise that Lord of Emperors was one of, if not my very best read of 2025 so far, and I anticipate that it will make its way onto my 2025 whiskeys as well. So this was my very long, very rambly, very chatty look at my best books of 2025 so far. I hope that you've enjoyed this video, and if you have read any of the books that I've spoken about today, please let me know down in a comment below because I'd love to chat with you about them. For now, that is going to be it for me. Thank you very much for watching this video, and I will be back soon with a new one. Bye for now.